Hello, my name's Quentin, and this is my cat, Lucy. And we're here today to read to you episode 1 of the book, Pip and Kitten and the End of the World, written by David Congreve. Let's begin, shall we? When the world ended, Pip and Kitten were hiding in an ancient 6-foot-tall industrial fridge freezer that had been rusting in the back garden of the home where they lived with their aunt, Cribbage. Shielded in their lead-lined hidey hole, they were totally oblivious to the moment when a technician accidentally dropped a ham sandwich into the Large Hadron Collider, opening a small but glutinous singularity and starting a chain reaction that swiftly obliterated every human being on the planet. Animal life, fortunately, was unharmed, with the sole exception of pigs, who were also rendered extinct. There is some debate as to whether this is due to the similarities between human and porcine anatomy, or whether the contents of the aforementioned pork-based sandwich played some part in the horrifying development of a world without bacon. None of these details were known to Pip and Kitten, and in fact they remained in the fridge freezer for a further 45 minutes until the air began to taste like cabbage, and Pip decided they should venture outside. Pip, an 8-year-old boy, somewhat short for his years, had neat blonde hair, sad brown eyes, and a bottom lip that had a tendency to jut outwards when presented with an unhappy situation. Being forced to hide in a rusty fridge freezer to avoid being whipped with a wet towel by his aunt, for example, had produced a pout of approximately 40%. Maximum bottom lip extension was saved for her more serious abuses. Not that this was a problem Pip was likely to encounter in the near future, given that the atoms that once made up his aunt's grotesque form were now scattered into the ether, searching for a more useful purpose, such as coating the outside of an empty tin of spaghetti hoops or lying in a puddle of badger urine. Ew. Kitten was a full-grown cat, 2.5 years old, making her name somewhat out of date, yet she tolerated it because Pip was always nice to her and fed her scraps of meat under the table when no one was looking. Aunt Cribbage, on the other hand, was intensely despised by Kitten. In fact, so visceral was her hatred of the woman, instead of spitting and hissing at her approach, Kitten pretended to be warm and affectionate in her presence, biding her time until Aunt Cribbage died and she could eat her face. A pleasure that Kitten would sadly never get to enjoy, given that, as we've already established, Aunt Cribbage's face had already been vaporized into a billion trillion impossibly small pieces. For a cat of Kitten's size, that would be less than a single crumb from a single cat biscuit. Initially, Pip noticed nothing amiss when he prized open the door, and Kitten, being a cat, was only concerned about finding something to eat or fight. But they both received their first hint that something was catastrophically, apocalyptically wrong when they registered an eerie, deafening silence. Pip and Kitten realised that something had changed at the same moment, and in the absence of anyone else with which to share their anxiety, shot each other a concerned look. In normal circumstances, the image of a boy and a cat doing an existential double take and then locking eyes would have been amusing, but it's not quite so comical when the hard-to-pinpoint wrongness in the air is the death of mankind and piggykind and the beginning of the end of civilization. Not funny at all. Although, all of the people who chewed with their mouths open, threw cigarette butts on the floor, and complained about the foreigners moving in next door were deceased, which is a little funny. Except not really. No, there was nothing at all to be laughing about, which is important to point out, because you need to be aware that when Pip let out an involuntary giggle, it wasn't because he had a dark sense of humour and was tickled by the thought of mass death. He simply knew something was wrong and couldn't precisely put his finger on what it was. And when Pip was nervous and unsure of himself, he giggled like, well, an 8-year-old boy. "Come on, Kitten. Let's go inside," Pip said, the tremor in his voice giving away his uncertainty. Kitten considered this for a moment, She had already been about to go indoors, but hated being told what to do, so she responded by flopping onto the floor and rolling defiantly onto her side. Pip rolled his eyes and headed toward the back door of the house. Kitten waited what she believed to be an appropriate amount of time to ensure no one could draw a connection between Pip's command and her actions before she picked herself up and ambled in the same direction. The back door led into a small, greasy kitchen. Pip hated the room because he was fastidious about cleanliness, and this was by far the dirtiest place in the house. He would have cleaned it himself, but the one and only time he tried, he accidentally broke a cup into exactly 37 pieces. He knew it was 37 because Aunt Cribbage locked him in his bedroom with the pieces and a tube of glue, and he wasn't allowed out until he'd cobbled it back together. To this day, it was the only drinking utensil he was allowed to use. It was rather leaky, but Pip had mastered the trick of clamping 3 fingers over the main cracks in the base and swigging the contents quickly before they escaped. The kitchen table held the remains of his breakfast: oats, powdered milk, and lukewarm water. He'd accidentally spilled some of the contents onto the table while mixing the concoction together, leading to a slap on his right ear and his flight into the depths of the back garden. Everything was as he'd left it, save for the absence of Aunt Cribbage. It wasn't unusual for the house to be as quiet as death, but it was somehow even more still than usual. It was so silent that Pip almost called out to his aunt to see if she was about, but he thought better of it. The less time spent with Aunt Cribbage as company, the better. With a bit of luck, Pip thought, she's gone back to bed for a long nap. With even more luck, she's gone to bingo and won't be back till 10 p.m. With even greater luck, she's gone to bingo and will go to her local haunt, the Dead Duck, afterwards, and won't be back until the small hours, followed by a day spent in bed sleeping off the hangover. It would be some time before Pip realised and accepted that Aunt Cribbage was never coming back, and that he had, in fact, won the lucky lottery jackpot. Kitten, if she could have talked, would have told Pip that Aunt Cribbage definitely wasn't home, but did her best to communicate the fact by letting out a loud trill and scampering in the direction of the hallway. Pip, not picking up on the hint, tiptoed after Kitten, shushing her as loudly as he dared. He climbed the old staircase, automatically skipping steps 4, 8, and 14, the noisiest and creakiest steps, and tiptoed into his bedroom. He shut the door carefully and sat next to a small bookcase with his back to the wall. It was the perfect spot from which to see the door opening. Not that there was much he could do if Aunt Cribbage rolled in angrily with the intent of thrashing him, but once or twice he'd been able to dive under the bed before she noticed he was there. Kitten immediately curled up next to Pip and fell fast to doze. Cats, as you may be aware, have various types of sleep that allow them to recharge their energy while still remaining alert enough to respond to opportunities to eat or start a territorial war with neighbouring felines. Yes, you do. The lightest sleep is called a rest. In this mode, a cat can appear to be asleep, but in fact is fully alert and will carefully consider every stroke, pet, and tickle to decide whether it should be permitted or severely punished. A deeper sleep that recharges the muscles is called a snooze. This is similar to human sleep, except that the whiskers remain active and capable of warning of impending danger. The deepest sleep is called a coma, and is only possible when the cat feels completely safe and secure. The whole body and mind recharges while the cat dreams of chasing, catching, and bringing down a fully grown cow. Somewhere in the middle of the sleep range is a doze, in which the body sleeps but the brain remains active. Kitten had chosen this level of sleep so she could rest, but still produce an appropriate level of purring based on what she knew would be coming next. "Let's find something to read," Pip said, looking over the small bookcase and weighing the decision of whether to start something new or read an old favourite. Once a month, Aunt Cribbage would go to the library to pick out a dozen salacious stories from the Thrills and Spoons series, and Pip would be dragged along and dumped unceremoniously next to the pile of kiddies' jigsaws and told to keep still and quiet on pain of a good thrashing. The jigsaws only went up to 100 pieces, so Pip finished the entire collection in under 40 minutes on his first visit, and spent the rest of the time looking longingly at the many shelves of books and wishing he was brave enough to openly disobey his aunt. After a few visits, a librarian spotted Pip working on the jigsaws, face down so as to create some meaningful level of difficulty, and brought over a couple of books for him to look at. Pip explained that he didn't have a borrowing card, so the librarian said that, well, they were old stock and were probably going to be thrown out anyway, and he should just put them in his backpack and not tell anyone. Pip had a suspicion that something about this arrangement wasn't quite right, but he didn't have the courage to question an adult, so he just did as he was told. This routine repeated itself for many months, during which time Pip amassed a nice collection of children's and young adult books for his bookcase, curated by his librarian benefactor. It would be terrible if you were to mistake the librarian for some kind of petty criminal. So you should know that after every one of Pip's visits, she would put money in the donation box to cover the cost of the books that he'd taken. But it would be equally terrible if you were to mistake the librarian for some kind of earth angel. So you should also know that a few months before she was atomized, she was fired from the library for getting drunk on the job and punching an irritating colleague, and that on her way out of the building, she stole an entire collection of Tolkien novels. Although this final act of rebellion may be viewed by some as a virtue rather than a vice. There was only one Tolkien book on Pip's bookcase, but it was far from his favourite. His best book, the one he selected now, was The Keeper of the Isis Light. "This is my favourite book," Pip said. "Excuse me, what are you doing?" "Oh, thank you." "This is my favourite book," Pip said. Kitten purred appreciatively, even though she already knew this to be true because he'd read it at least 5 times. It's about a girl and a robot who live on a planet, and she's really happy until some people show up and ruin everything. I think she'd have been better off staying on her own, don't you? Kitten didn't really have an opinion, but she gave a soft trill so Pip would at least know she was listening. The robot looked after the girl. He was just a robot, but I think he loved her. Some people think robots don't have feelings, but I think they do. Kitten had never met a robot and found the question a bit confusing, but she didn't want to appear uneducated, so she pretended to agree by stretching out and leaning into Pip a little closer. Pip settled back and opened the book to the first chapter. He read quietly to himself for about 10 minutes before Kitten's warmth and the excitement of escaping his aunt made him sleepy, and he dozed off, the book falling into his lap. Pip and Kitten slept soundly for almost 2 hours before they were woken by an enormous explosion. And that is the exciting end of episode 1 of Pip and Kitten and the End of the World, written by David Congreve. If you enjoyed this video, please click the like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next exciting episode of Pip and Kitten and the End of the World. If you'd like to know more, please visit pipandkitten.com. Also, if you would like to buy the book, please go to Amazon and search for Pip and Kitten and the End of the World. And there you'll be able to buy a book just like this, or download a digital copy for your Kindle or other device. Well, that's it from me and a very sleepy Lucy. We'll see you again soon for the next episode of Pip and Kitten and the End of the World. Bye for now.